What a joy and delight to be able to share with you today the works of Stephen Althouse in an exhibition that was just opened this past weekend, where we had an opportunity to be surrounded by really extraordinary and transformative or transformational works of art. As many of you know who attended these before, it's a rather freewheeling discussion using the images themselves and accessing both scholars, friends, rarely enemies, to talk about the work together with us. And today I'm just going to ask individuals to introduce themselves, and we can begin looking at the cover of the catalog, starting with Steph or Stephen, and then we'll go around the room, so to speak, the virtual room, as we're in many different places, the miracles of modern technology, to begin the conversation. So, Stephen?
Well, hello. I'm really pleased to be here, to be able to speak with my friends and colleagues. And I'm so pleased with the exhibition that's at the Pucker Gallery. And there's the catalog, which was published for this show, and it's outstanding. I'm hoping that if you can get to the gallery, see the exhibition, and take a catalog with you, that would be wonderful. So that's it for me. Next.
It's always available as an e-catalog too from the gallery website. Roger, and your relationship to the work itself would be helpful too.
Sure. I'm Roger Manley. I'm the former director of the Gregg Museum of Art and Design at NC State University. And a few years ago, we hosted a show of Stephen Althouse's work, and it was quite a hit with our public. And I'm just delighted to be able to come back and talk about it some more. So that's who I am.
Rusty?
I'm Rusty Herbert. I'm an associate of Bernie's in the gallery. I have a particular love for photography, and once Steph brought his work in and we took a look at it, it was like, this is amazing material. And you're going to see that in the course of this webinar, but it's really, really wonderful images that we're going to get to see. And for me, that feeds my soul.
And Caroline, please, because you're a fundamental part of all these operations as you've grown into this role over the past months and years.
Yes, I coordinate the WebinARTs for, I guess, a little over a year now. And my background is in fine art. I have my master's, which focuses in ceramics, but I kind of think of that as a focus in sculpture, which I really enjoy Stephen's work because it's really, they're sculptural both in their size and in the content. So they're exciting objects to talk about.
Wonderful. So let me just begin with a quote from the writings of Brother Thomas, which I often do. These ancient memories seem to remain and emerge in symbols. And we're going to be looking today at images that speak of the past, speak of the fragility of human existence, and as our guide to engaging with these images, the artist himself is part of that. So let's look first at the first slide to provide a sense of scale. Rusty was willing to pose next to this piece, which is approximately 4 feet high and about 8 feet long. We'll be looking at the image itself in a moment, but try to think about scale. And just as having been in the gallery business for 54 years, the issue of framing a piece of this size, of this elegance and delicacy, and making sure that it is presented as best we can. So now we can look at the image, and let me ask Stephen to begin by talking a bit about the background of how this came into being.
Yes, this is looking at memory. It's looking at it's illuminating a collective human experience that everybody has faced throughout time, and that's taking care of your family when they're failing. And both my parents, they were senior citizens, separated, failing because of their age. My mother was failing cognitively, and my father was failing physically. And then my younger sister, my only sister, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And for a few years, I was shuttling all over the place, just trying to make sure that their lives were comfortable and just taking care of their needs, not necessarily their daily needs, but just being with them and trying to make sure that things were going well for them as they declined. And within 2 years, they all passed away of each other. And I was in my neighbor's barn, who happened to be an Amishman, and saw this broken wagon, and said to him, I think that wagon is me. I feel that way. I feel broken. And he understood exactly what I meant, because he had seen me for years driving all over the place to help my family. And so he took that wagon, hitched his horse up to it, and kind of limped it down to my barn, and I was able to photograph it. And more or less as a self-portrait, but also it's a collective experience that all of us will be having, and throughout time. It's something that's just part of being human. And so that's the background behind the piece. It's a very personal piece, but I'm hoping that people can find inspiration even without knowing that story as well. If they look at the piece, I'm hoping they can find their own inspiration and meaning in it as well.
So Rusty, you function very actively as a physician for close to 40 years, dealing with giving life in the sense of doing in vitro fertilization, but also before that, intending to people at all stages of life and death. And how do you think about this? How do you respond to it?
I think first of all, just to comment on the technique, this is an isolated old wagon. There's not stuff around it. Steph has created a technique that allows us to get the full sort of emotional hit or the emotional aspect of these images. And when you're here, and we'll have a little close up in a minute, but when you're here, you can see how detailed each piece of this wagon and other things is. Each piece is, whether it's cloth or wood or whatever it may be. And I think I speak to that because I think the technique is critically important relative to the emotion that gets transmitted to us. Steph obviously has had an experience, and he just relayed it to us. And he says, I need to get that experience out in some way. The way I do it, he was a sculptor, and now he is working through the medium of photography. But it's still, how do I take this thing that's inside me, that's an emotion, and make an object? And maybe other people can share that emotion. Maybe that is a more universal, which clearly it is. So, as a physician, but even just as a human, the whole idea of aging, breaking, gradually not being able to function as well is just so wonderfully captured in an object that doesn't gets old. Sure, everyone just says, oh, get a new one. But by capturing this, it makes us stop and think about that process. It's almost an anthropomorphic experience where the wagon becomes sort of a human of some sort in that way. But I go back, and at some point, Steph, I'd love for you to just take just a very short time and talk about the technique that allows us to get this kind of image.
We'll do it later, but Roger, I want your thoughts as a museum person, as someone who's dealt with art the better part of, I would assume, your adult life, and how you respond to this particular image.
Well, sure. I mean, one of the things when Stephen first came by and unrolled some of his huge prints, one of the things that struck me right away was just the tremendous presence they have. The actual, I mean, you know, we saw that picture a little bit earlier of Rusty standing next to the photograph, but you really have to realize this wagon is life size or reality sized when it's hanging on the wall. I mean, it's the size of a wagon, and you get up extremely close to it. You can be inches away from the photograph and see every you know, shred of wood grain and dust speck and cobweb or whatever that's on it is incredibly present. And one of the things that, you know, that I think that is important in what museums do is bringing people in touch with real things. You know, so much of our lives these days are led in sort of digital realms, or looking at things in books or on screens and things like that. And one of the things that a museum does is bring you face to face with actual stuff. And Stephen's work really does that in a grand way. And one of the things I admire about it is this is kind of a photographic thing, but I was a photographer for years and years before I became a museum director, and realizing the sheer depth of field in this, that not only the objects that are close to you and are in sharp focus, but even the things that are further away, and that requires quite a complicated technique too, of layering the focus. You know, these are not just a single shot, but that they're assembled in order to bring everything into focus and make everything as clear and sharp as possible. So that, yeah, when I saw this stuff, I realized how unusual it was, how remarkable his technique is, and felt like we really had to bring it to the public and show it at the Gregg Museum.
which is fabulous for everyone, both for the museum, for the students of the university.
Mm-hmm.
So, Stephen, do you want to talk recently? I think this is a good time to do the close-up of the inscribed Altdeutsch. Have you render that for us in English, if it's okay? And then respond a bit to both what Rusty and Roger have said about the combining of your own emotional state, the image, and needing very strongly the technical ability to realize visually where you want us to be and where you are.
Okay, I hope I can remember everything. One thing that annoys me if I hear some fantastic music is if one of the instruments is slightly out of tune. The musician may be playing beautifully, but I get annoyed if something is just not quite right. The sound has become degraded, and I believe that my approach to visual arts is trying to prevent anything from degrading the image in any way, so that I can completely enjoy it visually, similar to listening to some music where all the instruments are tuned perfectly and the work is being played beautifully as well. So I approach my imagery as a photographer, even though I don't have the photographic traditions that most photographers may have. My background is in sculpture. All my studies were in sculpture, and my early works were sculptural. Then as I started finding magic in objects, finding a vocabulary in ready-made objects, I started to formalize the pieces with photography. Now, as a sculptor, the scale is just one of those elements that all sculptors have to consider. You just, when you're thinking of a piece, if it has to go big, it goes big. If it has to stay small, then it stays small. And so, since I like a lot of my pieces to, as let's say, transcend the ordinary and become more of a monument to our species, then I have to use large format film and really big cameras, and it is tedious. It's tedious work using a view camera on a tripod. These exposures are long. I always use available light. I never use artificial light or like studio lights. It's always window light or any light that's coming in through any doorways. And so the exposures are long, and it's not a lot of fun. In fact, my least favorite part is photography. That's my confession. But anyway, so in addition to the actual piece, and this piece is more of like a self-portrait. I occasionally have to embed words into the piece, but I try to do it in a way where it's not going to be overwhelming. It's not going to become overpowering, but more just add mystery. Nobody can read it other than myself. And these are words. This happens to be the first language of my Amish neighbors. It's Pennsylvania German, and actually the neighbor who loaned me this wagon helped me translate it. And you'll see in this, it's kind of looks like it's carved into the wood, and it's done digitally. That's one of the last things I do on the piece, is to put my words into it. And it's also quite time consuming. If you were to zoom in on the words, you would see that the wood grain goes into the carved recesses of the letters, and each word or each letter, each character is worked on. It takes hours on each character, just to try to make it look as if it was actually there. Not that I'm trying to be dishonest, but I'd rather have it be blending in rather than being overt and in English where it might dominate the piece. So it says, to carry the heavy load, I was willing and still am willing, but I am now unable. And that was the feeling I had after those years of taking care of my parents and my sister, and then having them finally pass away.
Caroline, back it out to that last slide, just so we can see again where this is and how. So you don't have, do you have an arrow you can use, Caroline, by chance?
I can circle it here with my mouse. I think everyone can see it. It's along
right here. Along that, right?
Yep, that's correct.
And if you look at it, it doesn't, as Seth was saying, it doesn't stand out at all. You have to look into the picture. You have to engage in this photograph in order to see it. And then once you do engage, it's often a foreign language, and we'll see more of that, which is a requirement to go further to understand it. So there's a combination of things at play here, but you can see how delicate it is relative to the overall image.
Let me just end the discussion of this particular piece with another quote from Thomas, that art is something seen about something unseen. Art is something seen about something unseen. And I want to hold that as we move to the next image as well, to encourage us who are talking about the work, but anyone who is looking in on this, to engage with that process, to look and see very carefully and realize that there are essentially not only inscribed but encoded meanings within each of these pieces that you need to personalize. So I'm going to ask you, Roger, if you would begin talking about this. This is not a tool or a useful object in any way, but it has a physical, emotional, and I would say almost spiritual presence That was the one in the slide next to Rusty earlier on, that's about 4 feet by 8 feet. So it is, wrong word, enormous, but its scale is enormous. And especially because the wheel probably is what, 16 to 18 inches in reality, as opposed to the way it's now transformed here on the screen and in the photograph. So Roger, your turn.
Well, you said it's not a useful object, but it originally was.
Yeah.
And it in fact was a wheelbarrow wheel, as I learned. And the whole time that we showed this at NC State at the Gregg Museum, I had assumed it was the size of a wagon wheel, but it's quite a bit smaller than that. But one of the things that when you're looking at anything like this, we're all bringing to it a whole background or load of cultural associations and things that we've learned, and wheels throughout the whole history of art and even beyond that have symbolized the cycle of life and the ongoingness, the idea of journey, the reincarnation, suffering. Wheels were used as a medieval torture instrument, and there's everything from Ezekiel's wheel within a wheel vision to the death of St. Catherine, that we bring to it. And in this case, it's superimposed on cloth that I think anyone associated with the history of art would sort of associate with the shroud or the robe of Jesus and things like that. I think one of the things about Stephen's work is that he's not just presenting the object as an object. And there have been other photographers like Walker Evans who photographed tools and was celebrating the shape of the tools. Kleis Oldenburg, blowing up ordinary objects so that we would see them in a whole new way. Karl Blasfeld blowing up images of plant life, and Marcel Duchamp showing common objects, but they were all using those objects as sculptures. But in Stephen's case, he takes it a whole level further, where they become portraits or complex kind of symbols of things that rely on a whole host of associations that we all bring to it. And I can see this as a circle of hammers almost, as well as a wheel. It's just all kinds of emotional impact created by the way he's put these things together, and then forcing us to see them on a huge scale, and yet at the same time up close and where we can read the words. And I'm going to stop talking so that we can talk about the words embedded in this particular piece.
Well, let's do that, and then we'll come back to the piece itself, Caroline. Caroline, do you want to read the inscription here?
Sure, I can read the English.
Yeah, that's okay. You go with
not
the
the 16th. I took German, but not 16th century. It says, "Where shall I turn to? The woods are barren of leaves."
Yeah, Rusty, how do you respond to the words themselves in the context of the image?
Well, they come from a story, and Steph can tell the story. But where shall I turn? Of course, a wheel does turn. And it can turn in different ways. It can rotate, it can turn whatever it's attached to. So where shall I turn? Ask the question, where will I go? The fact that the woods are barren of leaves is an allusion, I think, to the etiology of this whole photograph. Carolyn, if you can pop it back one more time, just to the whole, yeah. So, and I'll ask Steph to talk about what brought this, what created this photograph. But for me also, the fact that the wheel is in the position that it's in, it's lying down, it's retired, or it may be dead. and
Mhm.
it's laying across or on top of this white cloth, which I always call it shrouds because they're so reminiscent of shrouds.
Mhm.
And the shrouds are sort of bunched up, and you know, this wheel, this object, which is obviously quite old, and you know, you could almost say maybe it would function if you did it, but it's not going to be a very good wheel. But it's not. It's lying down. It sort of gives you it gives you an emotion of something that is probably not going to function. The only other thing I would say is we can't really show it well, but each of those little tiny ties are from a cotton cloth or linen type cloth. And when you look at them closely, when it's blown up in this large, I mean, you can see every single strand of what makes that cloth. And so the sense that the mesh of the cloth is some combination of things is equally as important.
Steph, you get a chance.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to comment about the cloth. Yes, we call it the cloth as a singular element, but in reality, as Rusty has mentioned, and also as Roger has mentioned, Roger was talking about there's a spirituality behind this cloth, and then Rusty's talking about every thread, and in reality, that cloth is comprised of thousands and thousands and thousands of strands of threads that are woven together to create this one piece of cloth. And for that reason, I think it's important for us to see it. And the cloth, if you'll notice on our next image, the cloth I usually will drape in a much more peaceful manner. This cloth is really bunched up and agitated, and I was upset at the time. So my own personal emotions are infiltrating into this piece, and it's another piece that deals with death. The first piece of the wagon that was dealing with carrying the load and no longer being able to carry the load, having my family die. And then this piece was, as a result, it was done in mourning for a very good friend of mine, an Amishman who was felling a tree for firewood one winter, and it fell on him and unfortunately killed him. And so this piece was done in mourning for him, and I was quite upset at the time. And the leaves are barren, the woods are barren of leaves, is kind of a nice poetic metaphor for how I was feeling. There's no leaves on the trees, and where shall I turn? When we have all lost people, and it takes you back. It makes you sit back and you just wonder, about your own life. You wonder about what you could have done perhaps to make the relationship better. And it's just so many questions happen. And so that's the background for this piece. I have another piece that goes along with it, which is a really nice piece, but boy, it's a long one. It's a two-person saw with rope hanging off of it, and that I think would be a little bit too large for the gallery. You might have a problem in the elevator with it. Anyway, I'm hoping I answered some questions about the piece.
Let me just add now, if you will, two things. One of which is that in very traditional Orthodox Jewish communities, they wear something called tzitzis, which are a little vest with each of the four corners with raveled either silk or knotted thread. And the four corners obviously represent the four corners of the winds and so forth. They also theoretically remind us of what the rabbis thought were 613 commandments that define how we should live. So there's a kind of, for me, the sense of being worn in part of everyone's life. And the other, of course, is that in the same communities, particularly in the Middle East and in Israel, when a person dies, they try to bury them as quickly as is possible, one, because of the heat, and they're simply, body is washed and wrapped in a simple shroud. And it very much brought to mind a time that we were in Bnei Brak in Israel, where the father of an associate had passed at 10 o'clock in the evening. And the community wanted him to be buried by midnight. And his teacher, who was even older, said, no, to honor his memory, we have to let other people know of the death. So it was at 6 o'clock the next morning that this took place. So the notion of both loss, honoring the passing of someone, and also realizing that each one of us will sometime go down this road, maybe not with this wheel, but certainly wrapped in some kind of shroud, is relevant. And the next image that we'll look at also includes a shroud, but in a very different, elegant presentation, carrying with it, for me, that memory as well. And Roger, this is a wonderful piece to talk both about tools and utensils, as well as the dignity of the presentation itself.
Yeah, I mean, it as a tool, you know, it's a old-fashioned farm rake, and with this piece of cloth hung on it, but it brings to mind the crucifixion. You can see those as raised arms, the fork in the wood, you know, nailed to a cross. The tines almost look like nails. But also things like Veronica's veil, the cloth that was offered to Christ on his way up to be crucified, and that his image came off on and was, you know, transferred, as well as other things from the history of art, like the Roger van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross, you know, where there people are being, where Jesus is being lowered from the cross while suspended in the cloth. All this is kind of, I would say, embedded in this kind of an image. It's a very simple image in some ways, and a very complex image in many other ways. And the complexity is largely what we bring to it in trying to understand it and interpret it in a way that makes some kind of sense to us. It's a beautiful image. You know, the fork in the wood is obviously a living, was once a living tree, and has just been repurposed in the simplest possible way to turn it into a tool for scratching the ground. This is one of my favorite pieces that Stephen has done. I just find it endlessly, you know, watchable, and it's just full of all kinds of associations.
It's a lovely way to think about the unexpected. So the use of this ancient used rake, where you feel the hands of someone who've literally worn down the wood itself, and then the use of the drapery to evoke all the things that you said. I would just encourage everyone who looks at the work to realize that you are part of this process. Namely, you bring to it what you can then invest in it, because it is both evocative and provocative.
It's
so, Rusty, sorry, go ahead, Roger.
It's participatory. I mean,
exactly.
Not there just telling us something. It's something you engage with back and forth.
Exactly. Rusty, you engage with it.
Yeah, two things. One is that this is a constant aspect of Steph's work, is that it is inviting. Even when it's sort of a rough or a tough or whatever it might be from a content point of view, they're always inviting. in this particular piece, I can see, Roger, why it's one of your favorites. The cloth in this case, well, first, it's a combination of very soft, beautifully draped cloth with a ragged old rake, right? And so you already have some kind of a contrast that draws you in. You think, why would someone put this beautiful cape around this old rake? And so it's jarring a little bit. It begs the question, you know, what's really happening here, which is what draws one in if you're willing to stop. And today's world, not many people are, but if you're willing to stop and engage in an artwork, a two-dimensional artwork like this, and look into it and ask the question, it really, all of Steph's pieces do this. And it's the nature of the objects, which he spends a lot of time deciding, you know, do we use this or don't we, and how, and it has to resonate with him. And then again, I would only say in this case, the cloth, very distinctly different than the cloth we saw just before. This is almost a cape, right? There's almost a cape aspect of it as it crosses under, you know, the rake itself. That is beautiful, very soft, very elegant, again, the wonderful contrast that sort of says, I'm looking at this older object through some eyes that make it beautiful.
Steph, your turn, and then we're going to move on, but it is really quite stunning. And I would just point out that one of the teeth of the rake is missing as you look at it on the far left.
Yeah, well, thank you for those comments. I think one of my motives, for example, with this piece, is to, when I see this object, for example, the rake, when I saw that rake, similar to what Roger had mentioned about the wood, it's got some really interesting textures in that handle. It's cracks and checks, and there's a knot, and then somebody made it into a rake. Simply, it was not any work of art. It was just purely a simple functional decision to take that fork and put it on the cross piece with some fingers sticking out of it, and it's been used. It's been used a lot. So people have used that. There's a lot of people's histories that are actually enveloped and inside that piece of that artifact. And what I like to do is to take these simple objects and transform them. Can this be transformed into something above and beyond that simple rake? The cloth, I don't know, I can't remember who mentioned it. I think it was Roger mentioned the shroud or the Saint Veronica's handkerchiefs. I was affected by the Spanish painting as a young man before I was even interested in art. I had visited the Prado Museum and I saw a lot of Spanish painting, and because Spain was a Catholic country, most of the religious paintings dealt with Catholicism, and there are some incredible paintings just dealing with cloth. And the cloth, for me, has a very strong spiritualizing characteristic. So how can I take two elements, taken out of context? Let's take this piece of cloth that's just, you see it folded up in somebody's drawer somewhere, and this simple tool that would be, leaning against any sort of barn inside. How can I take them out of context and put them together and somehow make them more than what they are? And that's what I like about this piece. For me as well, it becomes magical for me. It becomes powerful. It takes my breath away when I look at it. And but looking at the two elements by themselves, in their normal context, they were just average things. So I'm hoping that comes across to the public as well.
Steph, I would say primarily that one of the jobs of an artist is to create that transformation from the ordinary into the special, transform it into a way that evokes many thoughts and responses on a wide range of people who come to it. So let's say for the moment you're an artist, and we'll move on to the next one. Caroline, I would love if you're willing to just talk briefly about your response to this, the luscious black in the background of this, the texture of the braille. How do you respond to this, and how do you feel when you look at it?
Well, one thing that I've always noticed in Stephen's work is the quality of the materials. Not only is it, there's stone and metal, it's really stone. I think that's the aged quality. You can't fake that in another object. And I think how honest the material that he's photographing turns out gives it and then blowing it up to a large scale so you fall into it. It's very visceral. And I think that helps with, a lot of the context is, our shared humanity. And I think by using the materials he does, stone, wood, metal, that's aged, really gives it this gut feeling. And I think it elevates it to put it into this black, literally quite velvety background. You not only fall into it, but it puts, I know not everyone thinks the same, but I think a lot in images, and these become very visceral icons of these ideas such as life and death and the struggle that we all really do share together that are quite difficult to talk about. That's what they do for me. I just getting up close and seeing every little dimple, and then being able to really explore that surface like a topography is what excites me about the work.
That's great, beautiful. Rusty, your thoughts?
It's a very interesting image. There are a number of pieces that have weapons. Some are more literal. Some of the early work Steph did was quite literal with weapons. This could be an axe in terms of work, or it could be something that harms someone. It's again wrapped in cloth material in a unique sort of way. It's by doing the cloth this way, I get a feeling of someone creating something, not so much something that's past or whatever, but this is almost an active role that the cloth plays by weaving it or wrapping it this way. There's a wonderful cross there in the middle of it, which can be evocative. And then of course the braille that is superimposed on this axe. Steph can talk briefly about braille because it's his way of communicating something in a specific way, and I'll let him speak to that. But the braille is beautifully, placed. I mean, you would think if you didn't know, you would say, well, it's probably just bumps, and then you say, oh my God, you're right, there is something there. So the way it was put in, but the overall effect is an interesting combination. It's not as clear to me that the implication of the axe and the cloth, but they certainly do go together in this way in a unique fashion.
Steph, since you've been referred to, your thoughts about the use of the braille, but also to Rusty's point about the X in the very center of the fabric itself. And you just looked at the art of Samuel Bach, and that X generally means Xing out, meaning death.
Well, this may have, and it probably does have, references to death. In fact, I shouldn't say it may. It for me it did. The quote that I put in the braille, since it was mentioned, is from the Amish hymnal, and the quote is read at the burying of the departed. And it's just a very small part of a longer line. The long line, which I've taken half of it for this piece, is referring to how people respond when they're facing death, when they know it's time and their time on earth is going to end. And the quote, which I've used in other photographs, which I love a lot, has to do with how people respond. And usually the quote goes like this: the one goes forth with joy, and the other goes forth with heartbreak. So in this particular piece, it says the other goes with heartbreak or grief. And so it's expressing how some people approach death. The Braille is a code. You know, some people have always curious why I don't just write it out so people can read it. You know, I go to great lengths to hide what I'm trying to say. But the Braille is an interesting cipher. And I use it. I don't have blindness in my family. I don't have the actual physical optical impairment as a problem that I face. It's, for me, is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for humanity. We're wonderful. I love our species, but throughout history, we just keep making the same mistakes, stumbling over the same problems, perpetuating atrocities. And I just don't understand ourselves. And I'm not trying to make judgment. It's just a question that I constantly wonder about ourselves. So the Braille to me is a fitting way of writing. Since I feel like we're metaphorically blind, why don't I write in Braille? So this piece is an axe of, it's actually an old axe meant for felling trees. And it was done similar to the time of the wheel. And it's the tool, it's not the actual tool. Of course, it's an ancient, as Caroline said, it's got a beautiful topography. The pits in the metal are just incredible. And if you look at it closely, it does look like a moonscape almost. But it was the same type of tool used by my friend who was felling the tree that took his life.
Let's move on to the next one, where we're moving from shrouds and implements of cutting down trees or wheels or wagons to a simple implement. And talk, Rusty, a bit about scale, and we can probably move to the next slide and then come back to give you some sense of the scale of the wrench itself. So Caroline, can we look at the woman? Or there you go. So that's approximately the size of it. You have the hands of the individual. The photograph, now if we go back to it, is anywhere, this looks to be one of the medium size, but there's still 3.5 by 6 feet. So it certainly has a different physical presence for sure, with the person standing next to it as well, to provide everyone with a sense of this transformation that the artist has created. And Rusty, if you want to talk a bit about it, and then Roger.
Sure. Well, this is one of the pure tools, if you will, pure objects. You know, it's has its mouth open, but it's represented in and of itself. And this is probably one of the sculptured images, if you will. Again, I always go back to the fact that that these are looked at as sculptures, that the shape as well as the wear and the the denting and the all that goes with it that shows its age. The combination is, this one is the spiral, the slope of the handle, the squareness, if you will. I mean, the objects, the different types of patterns here are all captured in one very wonderful image. But it is indeed, I think, the scale of this, when you see the couple of slides down, how large it is, which then just is overpowering when you see it. To see this, you know, in a very small, you know, 8x10 or something like that, it's sort of interesting. When you see it on a large scale, suddenly it's the David, you know, this standing on end, and maybe it's a person in some way, but it's just very pure to me, a very pure image.
Roger, I know you responded to some of the aspects of the tools that he uses and the implications thereof. So please.
Well, not to contradict Rusty in any way, but it's not entirely pure, in that when you get up really close to it, you can see that Stephen has embedded heraldic symbols in the upper part of the jaw. You can't even see it in this image, but the upper part that looks almost like the head of a duck at the very top. Right in that area, there are
it's actually on the bottom jaw where you there.
Oh, it is on the bottom jaw.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, then, anyway, they're embedded in the piece that give it. I mean, that rewards that closer look, and that push pull that you get with a lot of his, or almost all of his work, where you want to see it from a distance, and then when you, too often in photography, when you walk up close to a photograph, it falls apart. Particularly digital images these days, you sometimes get up close and you can see the pixels. It looks like a mosaic when you get up close. That doesn't happen with these images. The closer you get to them, the more, in some ways, the more rewarding they become. And you know, all the different, in this case, the spiral of the teeth in that little adjustment wheel, the shapes of you mentioned the square on the right, but you know, the half moon right to the left of that, teeth down below. I mean, the whole thing has this kind of sweep and energy, almost like a Brancusi sculpture or something. And when you see it in the gallery, it's about the size of a motorcycle. So it's really has a kind of a super presence about it that makes it more than it is. And I just find that really fascinating.
Let me just say that another of the quotes that I like of Thomas's is, artists are the discoverers and custodians of the unlooked for. They see beyond and yet stay the course. And as we move to the next image, try to keep that in mind, as well as the tool we just saw. So Stephen, if you could talk briefly about this. So the other thing that I'm finding interesting for me is, now I see the dates of when these photographs were created, and the last one was 203, we're 209, there are others that have been 213. So there's a inner, if you will, journey that Stephen's on, and it might be helpful as we go through to just be a little more cognizant of the dates when they were done. So Stephen, your turn.
Well, what's interesting about the dates is I'm going back to as being a child. As far as my aesthetic, I think it hasn't changed very much since I was a child. My upbringing was on an old farm, a beautiful old stone house, and there's a stone barn in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which was settled really early during the colonies, actually, and before sawmills. So everything was done by hand. Everything. large beams were hewn, and all the handwork was left. And I could see it even as a child, seeing all these cut marks and evidence of people having built things and made things, has kind of stayed with me my whole life. And it's in a sense the journey, I'd say starting back maybe around 2000s when I started this type of series, where I'm really using that vocabulary that I think I developed as a child. And so the imagery is very similar. Over the past 20 years or so, I feel like it's one continuous series, and I work extremely slow. It's I ponder maybe too much. I just ponder, and and I reject so much. I really have to have it be the way it for me. It has to be just right for me. And so anyway, getting back to this piece, this is I just love the geometry of this basket. It's a wooden. It's made of wood, and it's used. It was used around this area where I live now for tobacco. Drying big leaves of tobacco, and they stack them up in these really flat trays or flat baskets, and then they could stack them on top of each other and wagon them to market. And but I just am fascinated by its construction, and primitive yet really perfectly geometrically perfect, even though it's so primitive. And then it just, for me, I just felt it had to have a book of Braille. It happens to be a Bible in Braille on top. I think if we look at the next slide, if there's a detail, yes, you can see this is just the book of Braille. The meaning of the words for me aren't as important as the other ones that we were talking about. It's just this absence of being able to read it inside of this incredible geometry.
I think it's very helpful, and it also is a constant invitation to everyone to look carefully, and you provide them with the detail once they do look carefully. Look at the bend in the wood in the background, and otherwise you would just see it as a total composition, as opposed to having the opportunity, because of scale, to get up close to these pieces and to enter into them. We're going to move along with a disclaimer that although these are scheduled for 60 minutes, this is going to be more than 60 minutes. So those of you that have other things, it will be recorded and available, and we're just going to keep talking. So this is the cover of the catalog, and I think it has lots of background in a very important way. So Steph, if you'll provide us with that, and then I'd love to have both Rusty, Caroline, and Roger respond to it.
Well, this piece is a tool, just like all the other things that we've been looking at. It's a tool, though, that bothers me, and that is the tool. We use tools to perpetuate violence and warfare. And it's just one of those things that I just don't understand, because throughout my life, I've had such wonderful experiences traveling and living in different countries where I've met wonderful people. And when I look at my experiences, my friends, I just think of, wow, what's going on when you hear about the news, and what's gone on throughout history. It just doesn't seem to like we've ever changed, or we've ever been able to learn. And hence again, my feeling that we as a species are metaphorically blind. We just keep going on and going on, doing the same things. And so this tool is horse armor from the Middle Ages. I think it was actually from around the 1500s, which was also the time of extreme upheaval in Europe, religious upheaval in Europe, when the Reformation started and people were, in the name of religion, killing each other. And it was a sad time. Now, the horse armor, though, as a tool, as this armor that encases a horse, I also was trying very hard when I photographed this, and I have to thank Pierre Trajanian from the Philadelphia Museum. He was the curator of armory there, who helped me, allowed me to photograph this one whole day. Went down there, and he, during the closing of the museum, so I didn't have to worry about people tripping over my tripod. But anyway, he sat there with me and just made sure everything was fine for about the whole day. But I was really trying hard to get a look, get some sort of, evoke some sort of, it's hard for me to put words into this, but I feel sorry. I wanted to have this beast of warfare with these insect eyes. I wanted us to pity it. And I feel, when I look at it, at least, that his head is tilted just a little tiny bit. I'm not sure how to describe it, but anyway, so I did write in Braille up on the forehead from the Ausbund, which is a hymnal that was written exactly during this time in the 1500s, during the religious strife that was going on in Europe. And the people who wrote it were ultimately executed, and but their words live on today. The Amish sing from this book. And here's it was all men who were writing this hymnal. Here's a man whose family is probably dissipated somewhere in Europe. He doesn't know what's happened. There's no communications. His life is probably going to end, and he's not sure whether his wife and children will be killed. Everything, all of his friends are gone. Everything is, his world is turned upside down, and his complaint is his harp is broken. It's a beautiful, for me, a beautiful metaphor for his life, his harp, his musical instrument. And so I put that in Braille on the crest, on the forehead of this horse. And are we then also blind? Another question about humanity. And then, in an effort to perhaps rein in the war machine, I put a knot in the reins on the very bottom, hence the name, the title of the piece. But I was trying to make a compelling portrait of this horse, not in a mean way. I didn't want the horse to look fearsome or just monstrous, but more of something that needed to be pitied. So there you go.
Roger?
Well, when I see this piece, one of the words that springs to mind for me is nightmare, and literally being a horse. It's a sort of an image of in some ways one of man's best friends, humankind's best friends. Horses and dogs have been with us since, the Lascaux cave paintings. That was one of the great themes, was their admiration of horses, and yet here it has been transformed from a sort of vegetarian, useful helpmeet into a weapon of war, and it gets at what is, I think, throughout Althouse's work is this sort of duality of human beings as both creators and destroyers, and that we have this duality within us that is so self-destructive and mutually destructive, and yet that same ability to create something. I mean, this is a beautiful object. It was beautifully made. I'm sure the armorer who built it took great pride in putting that loop of, that coil around its neck and everything to make it pretty. That's one of the big problems with war itself. War is unfortunately kind of fun. I think people who drive tanks and fire guns enjoy the experience at some level, and that sort of combination of beauty and suffering is all a part of this piece, and it's a tragic piece in many ways, but it's wow, it's really got a whole lot of things going on in it.
Rusty?
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece that I would agree with Roger, the combination of what sometimes we see as creation. In this case, this is a domesticated animal normally that becomes part of a war machine, and trying to present that incongruity, if you will, in a reasonable way. I know, having spoken with Steph, that he spent a lot of time on this particular image. It meant a great deal to him. And although he didn't acknowledge all the work he put into this, this was a hugely decorative piece when it started. It was meant to glorify the process of armor, and it therefore probably glorify the process of war or combat in some way. And through his various techniques, Steph has created an image that has removed much of the fancy glorification that was there at the time it was created, and now given us an image that allows introspection in a way that, had you just made a picture of what existed to start with, you would have thought, nice in a museum. This gives us, an image that removes much of the fancy to do. And as Roger said, I think too many people like uniforms and marching and and guns and things, and it all looks good in a parade, but when you get out on the battlefield, you die, and there's blood, and it's just terrible. And I think taking away that feeling of this is great, or this is amazing, this is fancy, and saying, using a horse and tilting the head just a tad, I think is a way that, with all the hard work Seth puts into this, he speaks to us, and we should listen.
Caroline, your thoughts?
Well, I'm a horse person. I grew up riding, and that's just it's great. I'm definitely, I just love them. I know that there's, as far as armor, I don't know a whole lot about historically what was done. I do know that sometimes there would be parade versions of armor and then the actual armor used, and I'm not sure what this would have been. But what stands out the most to me, being someone who's worked with horses, is actually the earpieces, because horses, they have terrible eyesight. Their eyesight's really just to detect motion that's, a predator. But their ears are really what they use to communicate and to listen. And when you ride a horse, they often turn their ears to listen to you. So this one, I think the ears are cupped so that the horse wouldn't be able to turn its ears back and actually listen to the rider. And that, when Steve was saying to something about, pitying the animal, that actually is probably the spot that I feel bad about the most for the poor thing. And other than having a big metal hunk of something on your head, there's certainly horses that were known to be excited in war and to be forward and to be excited by the event. But my experience, I mean, horses are they're very peaceful, very gentle creatures that have no idea how big they are. You can teach them to think you're much bigger than them.
That's an absolutely lovely thought. We're coming to the last image, but I just want to, before we get to it, thank all of you for sharing your responses and thoughts about the works. Let's look, Caroline, at the door with flames, which is 2017. Steph, I think you need to walk us through the making of the object before the taking of the picture.
Well, occasionally I'll have an idea, as do many artists, where you're starting with nothing other than ideas. And I had an idea of a door that looked similar to this. The wiggly shapes on the bottom of this door, that shape has always been a shape that has intrigued me, and some of my early sculptures employ that shape. And then the top part of it that has like these arches, that's similar to some niches, some religious niches that I've gotten down in South America. And so my idea was to have a door that has wiggly shapes and a hole in the top and some sort of niche-like architecture on the top. And so I built this this door and used just regular Home Depot wood, and it took nails. It's all nailed together, but the nails I ground down the head so that they wouldn't look so industrially manufactured. And then after it was built, and I put some hinges on it. After I made it, I put it out in the weather for a few months just to get it stained and looking, give it a patina, which perhaps would enhance its look. It was the wood was too bright white when I first built it, so it needed to be weathered. So it's just a straightforward, actually it's like a sculpture. I made a sculpture and then photographed it. And I was thinking about, I had lived in Spain for a couple of years and really enjoyed myself there. I had all kinds of wonderful adventures. And so I did put something referring to those flame shapes in the bottom. I put a quote in Catalan, and I don't know if we have do we have a close-up of the?
Yeah, I think we should. Caroline, isn't there one more slide? That's it.
Oh. So yeah, this was done digitally after the photograph was made of the object, and I think I've told you at the art opening that it probably would have taken less time for me to carve it into the wood than to work on it digitally, because each letter has to be worked on very carefully to get the lighting just right and the textures right of the wood to make it look as if it's been carved into the wood itself. So that is Catalan from northern. It's a dialect language. Some people call it a dialect, but it is a language that's spoken in Catalonia, which is the Barcelona area of Spain.
So, Roger?
Well, this piece, the first time I saw it, it did strike me as almost Moorish looking, and in that Spanish context comes right through. I actually didn't know you had made this piece till just now. So, and it's one that we did not include in the show at the Gregg, because just in order to give the exhibition a shape, we decided to limit it to things having to do with the Amish. So that this is a piece that I'm not that familiar with, but I was delighted to find out how it came to be. But yeah, when I first saw it, it reminded me of some of the architecture that I've seen in Spain and the Alhambra and places like that, with the way the roof lines and the window shapes and things like, you know, the just the general shapes and things like that. But it's not a piece that I'm so familiar with.
So can we go back to the image, Caroline, for Rusty, please?
Yeah, good. Thank you. I I think it's a fabulous piece. Again, and in this case, I think the writing really enhances this piece because it's an actual literal invitation. It reminds me a great deal of one of our artists, Sam Bach, here in the gallery. The whole idea of opening a door, meaning making a decision, and the statement that I fear its flames, but my questions beg me to open it, is such a comment about so many aspects of our lives, different times in our lives, both good and bad. The idea that you shouldn't do something or that you should do something, but that there's reasons that you at least feel maybe that you shouldn't. So he's taking the flames from below, those images that would be something like flames, and putting it in some sort of religious context. It just gives, again, this is what stuff does for the viewer is wonderful. And this is what good art does for the viewer. And it, again, invites you in, asks you to look carefully, and then bring to it what you will and answer questions or think about what the questions might be. And this is just a wonderful statement of that. It's a wonderful way to sort of maybe end our discussion, because we are invited into all of Steph's pieces. And sometimes there's language, sometimes there's not, sometimes it's just the image, but there's always the invitation, always the option to dig deep and see what it can bring you relative to some kind of constructive thought for your life. So thank you, Steph.
Let me just thank everyone for being with us, and to end with one further quote, that there are never words without experiences, but there are many experiences without words. And I must say that we certainly showered words upon these wonderful images, but at the same time, want to make sure that each of you realizes that this is an invitation for you to be present in these works and for these works to nourish you. So, Steph, thank you so much for what I think were called objects of uncertainty. It certainly seems that we were certain about some of our perceptions about what you have created, but at the same time, it remains an open question for all of us, simply to say thank you, and thanks everyone for being with us.